being on mute. So bonjour indire madre duck. Niigaan webinam Indigenous cost namago shendo dem ne minwandam omayayan. Ganabach bangi gisna agwajing zukupin agwajing. Bonjour na mishomasak na komasak. Namiji nibekwe. Mijana gijek. Miigwech Bodwewadan for your incredible gifts and the traveling of our leader to the west, our uncle to the west, who is on his journey now. So miigwech to everybody at ACC for including me in, I think it's called Indigenous Storytelling Week. Is that right, Chris? Or is
That's correct.
Indigenous
That's correct.
Week? Or
Indigenous Storytelling Week, and the fact that you were available just fit like a glove, so we pegged you in here. Yes.
Well, I was like, I wasn't quite sure. Like normally people want me to talk about the pandemic, so I don't really, I was sort of trying to figure out what I was going to talk about for today. But I think I'll just do some of the stuff that I was that I've got here. So pleasure to be here, everybody, and to spend a little bit of time with you. I'm going to just share my screen here. Here we go. All right. You can see. Everyone can see my slides. You can see my slides, yeah? So
yep.
Okay, yep. So hey everybody, this is the stuff that I do, and so my name's Niigaan, and I'm going to speak about a whole bunch of different things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about treaty today and what treaty is involving, and why it is that we talk about treaty, why it is that we talk about treaty being so important to refer to when we have relationships. Well, I just skipped over my slide there. But what I'm going to say today is I'm going to say that the most important issues you need to know to be employable, to be effective, and to be we'll call it non-conflictual, or invested in peace, or invested in relationships and healthy relationships, creating a place that all of our children can inherit in a peaceful, kind way, is Indigenous issues. You need to become competent on issues involving Indigenous peoples, and here's why. You have to be able to do two things when you're talking about Indigenous issues. One is to talk globally, to talk internationally. This was me at the World Court in 1 week in the Netherlands, and I'm speaking there and about the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. So if you would have heard recently that the federal Liberals have introduced Bill C-15 into Parliament, by all things pointing, it will pass, and C-15 will require Canadian law to come into alignment with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. C-15 doesn't create any laws, but it does require a modification of Canadian law. And what that means is that existing law within the country should do what it had already promised that it would do according to the Supreme Court decisions in the 1990s. So in the 1990s, the federal court, the Supreme Court, required Canada to identify what Indigenous rights are. Even though Indigenous rights are recognized in the Constitution, it's never been defined what that is. So what ends up happening is every time we have a little conflict or discussion around rights or a land claim, or can Indigenous peoples do this thing that we claim to be a right, but Canada says is not a right, or whatever, then we just end up in these endless $1 billion of marches to the Supreme Court, and costing taxpayers, frankly, all of this money, because Canada's failing to do its duty, which is to recognize and identify what Indigenous rights are. Of course, the simple thing to do would be to ask what Indigenous peoples are their rights, and because Indigenous peoples are the ones who are living those rights. Therefore, they would tell you what they are. They would be things like a right to our culture, our right to pick our medicines, or our right to govern ourselves, or our right to even tax ourselves. All of those things are forbidden under Canadian law. Under the Indian Act, we cannot tax we cannot tax even ourselves. We cannot govern ourselves. Chiefs and councils are not governings of it. That's what Canada's imposition on that. We cannot certainly pick our medicines wherever we want. There's tons of rules around that, and we certainly cannot hunt, fish, harvest, go to school, even parent our own children. There's rules in place, for instance, the situation of poverty, which is Cindy Blackstock has been involved in that case, to say that the 14 times the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal has recognized that Indigenous peoples are having their rights of parenting imposed or delegitimized or undermined because of the poverty on First Nations. The poverty on First Nations is corrected directly because of the Indian Act. It has nothing to do with Indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples do not mismanage money. It's that the money has been mismanaged for them and has been distributed in such a way that the controls and the abilities of us to create an economy is impossible, including taxation. We can't even tax ourselves. That's how governments work, but we can't even tax ourselves. That's the kind of conversations you have to have around Indigenous issues. You have to have that kind of competency, not maybe the same language that I have, but certainly you have to be able to have a regular conversation to talk about Indigenous peoples on a global level. But you also got to be able to talk to Indigenous peoples on a local level. So this is a picture right here of me in Nietzsche Commons in downtown Winnipeg, and talking about what it's like to experience poverty, or to be on the front lines of struggles involving policing or prostitution or gang violence or children in the child welfare system. You got to be able to have conversations at the local level and on the international level. That's the requirement of Indigenous issues for today. And Manitoba is the center, as I'm going to argue in this presentation, is the hub of indigeneity, not just in Canada, but in Turtle Island in North America. It's one of the hubs in the entirety of North America and the world of Indigenous life. And we can talk a little bit about what that looks like maybe at the end, but I'm going to make the argument that what we do here in Manitoba is a model to the rest of the world. Rest of the nation, for sure, rest of Canada, everyone follows us, frankly. What happens here happens elsewhere, but much later. But then also I would say throughout the United States and throughout the world as well. Now, you can see here that this was my graduating class at the University of British Columbia. And in that picture are all graduate students from different walks of life. They're doctors, lawyers, accountants, CEOs, tribal leaders, chiefs and councils. There's people from all different walks of life. This is what's called the future. There are Indigenous professionals leading organizations, joining workplaces at the rate never seen before. And as a result, then every single workplace is hiring, is embedding themselves, is engaging themselves in the process of understanding what does it mean to have relationships with Indigenous peoples? And as I'm going to argue in just a minute, if you don't have that ability, you're frankly unemployable here in Manitoba. If you don't know what the Indian Act is, if you don't know what Indigenous peoples you share territories with, if you don't know what a treaty is, frankly, you shouldn't have a job. You shouldn't be working in Manitoba, because not only are 1 in 5 people Indigenous, but 2 to 3 more times that have relationships with Indigenous peoples, are married to, sitting on the bus beside, are working with an Indigenous person. And the other third is soon to be one of those thirds. So my point of saying it is that the more and more that we can get used to the idea of Indigenous professionals within our institutions, and how do we work, how do we adapt workplaces, not that we expect Indigenous peoples to adapt when they enter into workplaces, the sooner that we recognize that Indigenous peoples are crucially a part of our economy, our cultural political life, and our social life, the sooner the better off that we will be. The sooner we'll realize that we are raising our children together. And that's what treaty was intended to do. Our treaties were intended for us to raise our children, like Little River here, and for us all to be able to get to know one another, to eventually, hopefully, join our families together, to be family members, not friends. That's what treaties are intended to do. Now, here's some stuff that I do. This is more of my professional stuff that I've done. I write a column for the Winnipeg Free Press, and it appears on Tuesdays and Saturdays, you can check out. So this week, my column was about Indigenous rights in the United Nations Declaration, Bill C-15. My column last week was about the pandemics numbers in Indigenous communities, the fact the Army is being sent in to deal with issues on First Nations. There's a really ironic moment happening right now because there is no health resources left to support First Nations who are the hardest hit by this pandemic, with the exception of maybe Steinbach. But the Indigenous peoples are hit harder than anyone else by this pandemic because of poverty, chronic underfunding, chronic undersupport, and the sickness passes much quicker. Army, that's all that's left that Canada has to send to support First Nations. That's interesting because what it tells you is that when Canada has nothing left to give, all it can send is help. And that's interesting. I think it's interesting because we're seeing, differently than 1885, where we saw the militarization of Indigenous communities, the Gatling guns being shot on women and children, massacres on Indigenous communities, the open murder of Indigenous leaders like Louis Riel. We're seeing a much different relationship today, and the pandemic got us to think in that way. The pandemic got us to think about how we're all in this together. That's what treaty is all about. Treaty is supposed to be about how we all rely on each other, and maybe we might learn a little bit from this time in how we understand each other and our relationships with one another. Now, my colleague there, Chris, at the beginning said territorial acknowledgement. Territorial acknowledgement, I think, is often misunderstood or misrepresented, or sometimes people don't understand why you're saying it. Here's why you say it. When you say a territorial acknowledgement, you're doing two things. You're seeing the people that you are a part of a territory with. So that's people who are most often disenfranchised or marginalized. Like, we do a very good job representing the contributions of English and French people. We don't have to say it. We know it. And in fact, it's in the flag itself. It's in the language we speak. It's in the very practices that we follow. But the people that we have disenfranchised, or that we don't recognize that we share territories with, we need to say it. We have to remind ourselves. And so that's what we're doing, is we're recognizing that we share territories with people whose traditional ancestral homelands we are now a part of. It's not that we superseded or erase that claim. They are still here. They are still present. They are still living with us. And that's why we say Dakota, Cree, Anishinaabe. Sometimes down on this territory, we'll say Ojibwe or Dene. Dene people have travel routes through this area. Sometimes we might throw in, sometimes we might throw in Lakota, Dakota out here in Treaty 1 territory, which is Winnipeg, but certainly out in your territory, out in the west there. And before I forget, and just before I forgot to really mention, but I'm a Brandon alum. I lived in Brandon on the North Hill, near the Sportsplex for a number of years. I went to Kirkcaldy Heights Junior High. So I'm in many ways a product of not just Selkirk, where I grew up and I was born, and the north, which is where I spent a couple of years, is when I was a kid, up in Ashering, Manitoba, north of Angel Lake. It's not really the north, but it's north. And then the other part of my life was the most formative years, which was junior high, and that was in Brandon. And so the Brandon relationship that I have is very tight and very important. I am still a humongous Wheat Kings fan, so if that helps at all. So anyways, so getting back to traditional territorial acknowledgements, the first part is we recognize the people that we share territories with. Second is, when we make a territorial acknowledgement, we're making a commitment. It's a promise. It's a law. You're saying, okay, I'm going to do this. That's what law is, by the way. Law is a commitment that we're all going to do things. So law is an actionable item. This is what a territorial acknowledgement. It's not just saying we share territories with this, but the second part of it is we commit to a spirit of reconciliation moving forward in the future. We commit to sharing the land, sharing resources, sharing relationships, whatever that might be. That is what our second statement is with our territorial acknowledgement. It is crucial that there be both. We see the people that we have historically left behind or not thought about or are committing to. And then here's our commitment. We promise to act well, to act responsibly, act ethically. That's what a territorial acknowledgement is. And a territorial acknowledgement is like law, an ethic, and a belief all wrapped up into one. Now, That's what we're really talking about today. We're talking about how it is that we're going to live together. Like, what is it that we're going to do when we live together? How is it that our children are going to live? How are we going to live peacefully? That's what we're really here to do. That's what storytelling is all about. So stories are about, they're like maps. They're like road maps. So all this week, I know you've been listening to storytellers tell you about their experiences, talking about maybe traditional Atazukonic. Our traditional stories are called the Atazukonic. Those are the living beings. And so when we refer to our stories, we'll call them living beings, that they sit with us for a while. Those are our creator stories. Those are the stories that we talk about creation. Talk about who we are, why we are the way we are, why the buffalo has a hump, why the sun travels across the sky. Those stories that we have to tell are the Atazukonic. They're different than the Debajamoanak, which is what I'm telling you right now. The Debajamoanan, which are those stories which can also be Atazukonic, but they're Debajamoanan, which are those stories which are based in time. They're like the story about your uncle eating too much Thanksgiving dinner and then throwing up on himself. That's a specific story for a time period. It's not a creation story, but it's a specific historically spaced story. And somebody wants to say hello. Oh, and look who's there. Say hello to everybody. Say hello to everybody at ACC. There they are. This is Nibby right there. And she desperately likes attention. She doesn't like it when I give attention elsewhere. Anyways, so speaking about living together, there's Nibby right there. But anyways, okay, where was I? I was talking a little bit about the stories, the principles of stories within our traditions. So you've been talking about stories all week. Stories are like a map. They're like, they give you the opportunity to see what we can be, to see what we can see, to see what we can imagine. That's what stories are. Stories are ultimately about space. So when somebody shares a story with you, they're creating space. They're creating space through a narrative. You're going on a journey together. You're all imagining those things that are being talked about. You're being asked to envision yourself in that space as well. And then you do something with the story. So when somebody offers you that story, then it's like a gift. It was what we call a bagajinan, which is when we offer that gift, you must pick it up. And when you pick it up, what are you going to do with it? Who are you going to tell it to? Or how are you going to let it shape you or influence you? How is that story going to live on beyond the story that's being told? That's why at the end of a story or at the end of a gift, or when somebody offers you something, you say miigwech. Miigwech does not mean thank you. And that anyone who tells you it means thank you is not thinking in terms of the language. Because when somebody says miigwech, it comes from the verb miigwe, which means I give. So what miigwech is miigwech is a commitment. It's like, okay, I will give it on, or I will give it back, or I will give it forward, whatever that will be. So when somebody says miigwech, what they're doing is they're making a commitment. So all this week you have been thinking about how are we going to live together? That's what your week has been all about. And I think we're on Thursday, right? So you've had 4 storytellers up to this point. Maybe you'll have another one tomorrow. But these stories are about space, envisioning, placing ourselves in it, enacting. That's what stories are ultimately all about. And I want to tell you a story right now in the spirit of storytelling this week is about the term kanata. So where does that term come from? Why is that term so important? What does it teach us? What does it ask us to do? Well, in 1534, a guy named Jacques Cartier, you may have heard of him, a French explorer, and he showed up and was, according to textbooks anyways, the first European to land in what's now called Canada. Now, for those of you that watch Curse of Oak Island, you know that that's not true. But anyways, okay, so anyways, if you watch Curse of Oak Island, you know there's some interesting stuff happening in that show that's showing some archaeological evidence. The Europeans were here certainly before Jacques Cartier, and that there's some really interesting stuff happening. Anyways, okay, a little shameless promotion there for Curse of Oak Island. Anyways, so Jacques Cartier, 1534, lands, and what he does is he comes down the St. Lawrence River, which is towards Montreal, and he lands at a place called Stadacona. Now that's what the Indigenous peoples called it. Cartier, of course, did not know the name of it at the time, just landed, saw that it was empty. And then what he did is that he put out on the land a 15-foot high wood cross. On top of that wood cross was a big metal plate, which said, La Vie de Roi de France. And Cartier said, I declare this land for New France, and blah, 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 and we claim ownership over it, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, of course, Cartier was ignoring that there were people there. Now, maybe he didn't see them, or maybe he didn't know they were there, or maybe he just ignored them. I don't know. But Donnacona, who is the chief of the Stadacona community, came down the river, saw all the kerfuffle, and then came onto the shore, and then immediately, within seconds, according to Cartier's records, pulled down the wood cross with the big metal plate on top of it. And much to Cartier's chagrin or confusion or dismay, Donnacona and his sons and his people, citizens from his community, pulled down that cross and refused to let it be erected again. Now, what does that tell you? That tells you two really important things. The first is that Indigenous peoples had respect. It's not that they didn't respect Cartier, but it's like if I walked into your house tonight and I knocked on the door, and maybe I didn't even knock on the door. Maybe I just walk right in, just let myself right in. I start rearranging the furniture. I put my name on a few items, write my name on the television, and then maybe what I do is I put a big 15-foot high picture of myself, and I put La Vie de Roi de Niigaan on the top of it. And then you come home and you're like, who's this guy? What's this intruder doing in my living room? What is this illegal foreigner doing in my house? What is this person who didn't ask for any permission, certainly didn't give me any gifts or was kind or was generous or in some way or made a relationship with me? Like, this person just barged in my house, declared he owned everything, marked up himself everywhere, rearranged my furniture. Like, what a jerk. Like, I don't even want this person near me. That's what Indigenous peoples were expressing to Cartier. You can't just walk into someone else's house and then to start moving the furniture. But yet Cartier thought he could and was entitled to do so. So Indigenous peoples was trying to teach Cartier respect, that there is respect here. Now, with respect comes law. Now, the only reason that we have law is because law is the certification, the textualization, the setting of rules in relation to respect. Law is about going, okay, here's morality, and therefore we're going to commodify that, and we're going to break it down into parts and then say, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal. Notice it's according to the Bible. Most laws are according to the Western tradition of the Bible. But those laws are based in ethics of respect. Okay, so you're saying to yourself, well, first is law is culturally loaded. It's not culturally objective. It's culturally loaded. And then second is that Indigenous peoples had law. The law was you don't walk into someone else's house without asking to do so. Well, that's called trespassing. And so what does that tell you? Indigenous peoples had law. If you have law, you have to have government, because the government's got to pass the law, or at least some kind of system to express what the law is. If you have images that are within a world that carry meaning, and therefore that meaning contradicts or contravenes the meaning that you have, and you know that those markings represent something different to the meaning that you wish to have taken within your space, then you have literacy. So what did we have on this cross was that Indigenous people certainly understand that an image carries meaning, that meaning carries action. Indigenous peoples understood writing. They understood semiotics. That means that Indigenous peoples were literate. So in this one story about, before I even talked about Kanata, from Cartier's arrival, from the seconds that he arrives, he realizes, cognizant, consciously or not, but that we know Indigenous peoples had respect, Indigenous peoples had law, Indigenous peoples had government, and Indigenous peoples were literate. Those basic principles lie all within that one story, that one action itself. And haven't even talked about Canada yet. So Cartier, of course, came to North America, not because he was curious, and not certainly, like Europeans did not come to North America because they wanted to know if the world was round. That is the biggest lie I was ever sold when I was a kid, that somehow Europeans were these curious, scientific experimenters, like maybe in a small way. But Europeans traveled to North America because they were broke, because they were experiencing an incredible economic depression after the wars in Grenada in 1492, the battles against the Moors, the Holy Wars, et cetera, et cetera. Europeans could not travel south because of those wars. They could not travel east because they had created such acrimonious relationships, trading relationships, also worried about thievery and having their goods stolen. They couldn't travel to the east, and they can't travel to the north because it's the Arctic. So what's your choice left? Go to the west. That's all Europeans had left, is to go to the west, to fortify and build their economies because they were broke. So when Cartier shows up in North America, he has no interest in Indigenous peoples. He has certainly no interest in the relationships with Indigenous peoples. He's only interested in spices and gold. That's what he's interested in. And so therefore, spices and gold is all that motivates him. He says to Donnacona, after he pulled his sons and the men pulled down the cross, he says, well, let's have a trade. Let's have a relationship here. And so Donnacona says, okay, you bring some of that, some of that metal, those axes. They were curious. Indigenous people's very interested in metal. And Cartier said, okay, well, you bring your spices and gold, because that's what all I'm interested in, is spices and gold. Most important commodities in the world at that point, things like cinnamon, gold, of course, from the imaginations and the dreams of the Incas, and kind of imagination that gold was everywhere in the so-called New World. But of course, Donnacona has no gold. He says to Cartier, I don't have any gold. I don't have any spices either. I have some riches. Why don't you try some birch tree there, Cartier? You look a little scurvied up. Birch tree, by the way, will save Cartier's life. So maybe his assessment of what are riches is a little problematic or a little incomplete. But Cartier says, I don't want any of that stuff. I want spices and gold. And I know that you know where they are. And so Cartier says, well, after a while, he realized Donnacona's not bringing any spices and gold. So he says, okay, well, I'm going to go look for it. And I know that it's somewhere. And so I'm going to take your two sons, Donnacona. And he does. He takes his two sons, captures them, puts them under decks, and he takes them as interpreters. And he says, okay, we're going to search for the spices and gold. It goes up the coast, community to community to community. And he doesn't find any spices and gold. Eventually starts to turn back to France. And he's in the middle of the ocean when Domagaya and Patagonia, the two sons of Donnacona, say, hey, we going home? Are we going home soon? And Cartier says, I don't know. Maybe we'll go back. Maybe we won't. I don't know. But if you tell me where the spices and the gold are, I will ensure your safe passage home. And Domagaya and Patagonia say, I don't know what you're talking about in terms of spices and gold, but I can tell you that the riches of that territory that you just came from were in Kanata. The riches are in Kanata. And Domagaya and Patagonia keep repeating that phrase, Kanata, to Cartier. Look in Kanata. And Cartier writes Kanata on the map. Canada, he says. And Cartier, for the rest of his life, he came back to North America 3 times, kept looking for spices and gold. Never found it, but kept dreaming about a Canada that frankly doesn't exist. Because I'll tell you what does exist. What does exist is Kanata. Now the word Kanata means village. And what Domagaya and Patagonia were telling Cartier was that the riches are in the ways we treat one another. The riches are in our commitments and our ethics to one another. The riches are in the fact that when we live together, when we believe in one another, when we love one another, we are stronger as a result. Everyone matters here. Everyone has a role to play here. Everyone can depend on everybody else. We are all in this together. That's Kanata, the village. That's what that word means, the village. Now, we still keep looking for Cartier's Canada. We call that shale gas, diamonds, oil, We keep imagining that that's going to give us happiness, that's going to give us the riches. Nothing about that is riches. No one ever became richer as a person due to oil. They became maybe richer monetarily, but they certainly didn't become richer as a person because of oil or shale gas or diamonds. Here's what you become richer as a person from: relationships, stories, sharing, commitments, roles, responsibilities, culture. All of that makes us better people, makes us ethical people. That's what Cartier was being told. And frankly, we've never recovered from that. We still continue to look for Cartier's riches in the land. But the fact is that we have two paths of relationships within the country. One is a path in which Kanata, the path of relying and depending and believing in one another, and that's here. You can see it in different elements of our society. I would say that sending the army to support a First Nation asking for its help is a good way to see that positive relationship of people believing and committing to one another. But there's this other side of Kanata, which is a side that only looks for the spices and the gold, oil, diamonds, shale gas, and will hell-bent try to take it from the land and anybody who stands in that way. That is the path of Canada, which is also the path of violence, dispossession, residential schools, the Indian Act, and genocide. The path of Canada has been always built on genocide. Violence, ethnic cleansing, murder, jailing, removal of children into the child welfare system. That's the path of Canada. We've never achieved the path of Kanata, the path that the village matters, that people matter, that relationships matter. We see it once in a while, like every once in a while we'll see it and we'll go like, wow, there's a moment there. It's happening right now, but then it ends and then it goes back to Canada. That's the challenge that we have to face one another. And I'm going to tell you about a moment that we saw that relationship in action, the Kanata relationship in action. And it's the first Treaty of Manitoba in 1817. In 1817, Peguis and Lord Selkirk meet together along the Red River, also along the Assiniboine River. So this ties you together as well, out in the west there. And they create the first Treaty of Manitoba. And the first Treaty of Manitoba is a commitment based in space. One of the problems, of course, is that Lord Selkirk and his settlers show up in Manitoba in the fall. Nobody shows up in Manitoba in the fall and expects to survive. You don't have a house. Like, how stupid are you? But Selkirk showed up in the fall with his men, and they almost all died. And Peguis escorted them to Fort Pembina so that they could survive the winter, and then they returned back to this territory after that. Peguis, however, says, okay, well, clearly you don't know what you're doing here. So here's what we're going to do, is we're going to create a treaty together. That treaty will be along the Red River so that you will be able to survive, because you need water to survive. You frankly can't survive if you're living elsewhere. So we will give you 2 miles on each side of the river to live, but we're not going to not use the river. Like, can you imagine what Peguis wasn't stupid. And Peguis would never have agreed to, well, okay, we're going to let you live by the river, but we'll never use the river again. Like, that's stupid. That doesn't make any sense. Peguis clearly was going to use the river again. There is something within Western ownership or Western individualism or Western principles of property that is so selfish and so one-dimensional and frankly so divisive. It's almost impossible to conceive of it, and Peguis did not conceive of it. What he did is he said, okay, well, you can live along the river. We're still going to use the river. And Selkirk's interpretation of that, however, like Cartier's, was that, oh, the land is now mine. It's mine. Nobody can come on it. Nobody can trespass on it. It is only absolutely mine. Therefore, the river is now mine. It's no longer yours. And of course, that's not what Peguis meant. Peguis meant we will share 50% of everything together. We will live together fully and completely together. But in Lord Selkirk's vision of this, it's that everything is mine. Now that you've given it to me, everything is mine. Of course, that's not what Peguis meant at all. Now, this is the challenge of what we face when we get to treaties. Europeans most often see treaties as land purchases, as this is now my land. But that's not the way Indigenous peoples view treaty. The way Indigenous peoples view treaty is this is now our relationship to share. And this space is ours to share. Our medicines are ours to share. Our stories, our meat, our children, all of it are ours to share together. You share your children with me. I share my medicines with you. We share this land together 100%, 50-50, all the way down the board. This is how Manitoba was supposed to look. This is the principles of how Manitoba was supposed to look. It was supposed to be about reciprocity, it was supposed to be about commitment, and it was supposed to be about tobacco. Tobacco is the language of relationship. For Anishinaabe people, myself, but also Dakota, Lakota, Cree, sometimes Métis people as well. Tobacco is the law of relationship. Growing tobacco is one of the hardest things to do. It takes a number of hours to grow and commit to it. Tobacco is not something that you grow, it's something you earn. And so that means that to grow tobacco from a tiny little seed, governments don't like those floating around, if you get one, to grow it to its full growth and maturation plant, it takes about 6 months, sometimes as high as 100 hours per plant of attention, in order for us to be able to understand those relationships to tobacco. Tobacco, which is drying right here, here's some leaves that are tied together. Tobacco is not something that you grow, it's something you earn. So you take 100 hours, you grow that tobacco, eventually you crinkle it, put it in your hand, you get a tiny little pinch. After 100 hours, you get the tiniest little gift, and then you give it away. Now, what is tobacco but an offering that then is intended to mean something? And that tobacco is meant to represent the time that you put into it. That time that you put into it, then therefore, just like a handshake, when somebody offers you a gift, you're expected to give a reciprocal gift, an equal gift, a sharing gift. That means that if I put 100 hours into something and I crinkle it and I make it and I give it to you, I expect 100 hours back. That's what we do with handshakes. That's what we do with stories. Notice how when anyone tells you a story, they always say at the end, and you? That's what we do with stories. That's what we do with anything. Like, can you imagine if you had a relationship with someone where you said, okay, I'm going to bring you a cheesecake, and they give you a bag of chips in return, and you're like, that's not equal. I worked all day on that cheesecake. You worked for what? Driving to Sev to get that chips? Like, that's not equal gift. Do you want to be a person who's the chip giver or the cheesecake giver? You want to be the person who is an ethical person who's committed to a relationship, who can help build a relationship, not somebody who can take and steal and exploit relationships. That you do not want to be that person, because then you'll get known as that person as not trustworthy, as not ethical. And frankly, that is basically how Indigenous peoples view Canadians in relation to treaty, which is that the Canadians have forgotten the original commitment of what that treaty was about, which is about tobacco. And in 1817, Pegwas said to Selkirk, we will let you live by the river. You can live on the river 2 miles on each side. We're still going to use the river, however, but we're going to live together. You're going to, here's the benefit. You get to survive. You're going to be able to build your own homestead. You're going to be protected. You're going to be part of our lives. You're going to be in the relationship with us, so that we will show you where the medicines are. We'll show you how to hunt and fish. We'll also show you which territories are safest to live or build your homes and so on. But we expect back 100 pounds of tobacco per chief. And as you can see here, the 5 signatures right here, 5 different chiefs. And he says, okay, 100 pounds for each chief. That's 500 pounds of tobacco. Now in 2020, it takes me 100 hours to grow the smallest little pinch. Can you imagine how long it would take to grow 500 pounds way back in the day? A lot of work. And what Pegwas wasn't saying is, I want you to be my tobacco importer. What he was saying is that I want you to commit to this relationship. We will live together. We will share the land meaningfully when we think and we act for each other. Sound familiar? That's the territorial acknowledgement. That's what treaty is. Treaty is about that action message in our commitments to one another. Now, unfortunately, this has not been the way Canada has operated. Canada has always tried stealing the land, and then 1763 legally passed a law via the Royal Proclamation to say, we are taking the land. Well, King George III said it on your behalf. King George III said, everything is mine, and then Canada made it law. So I don't have to, relive the way the dominoes have fallen. But I'll talk about Cartier for just the reason why Cartier was able to, come on the land, see it as empty, and then therefore put a big, huge wood cross with La Vie de Roi de France, is because he saw the land as empty. It didn't really matter if there's people there. In fact, the Europeans would carry, European explorers would carry what's called papal bulls on the ships. And the papal bulls would be decrees from the Pope, which would say, if you encounter savages or Saracens or non-Christians, they don't exist. They're like livestock. They're about as meaningful as like a dog. You can, move them around or make commands on them or control their lives, but generally you don't have to worry about them. They don't have any agency. They certainly don't have any laws. They don't have any land claims. Of course, we know that that's not true. Cartier's proven that to be not true in the very second he arrives, but yet he still acts in the vision of terra nullius, which means the land is empty. Now, British North America Act in Section 9124 makes that law, and says that Cartier's commitment or Cartier's taking of those lands, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, the Papal Bulls, the assertion that Indigenous peoples will become Section 9124, Indians and lands reserved for Indians will be the role and of the representation, of the responsibility of the federal government. And that's where we get treaties today. That's why treaties hammer themselves into those visions of Canada, but yet treaties also stand on their own. They are their own images based in images of reciprocity, of commitment, of those same things that Pegwas was trying to tell Selkirk way back in the day. Remember that these two paths of relationships are extremely important and influential, and they really make up the story of the country itself. The story of Canada is much that we have two different sets of relationships happening. One is a relationship based in reciprocity and commitment, and the other one, which looks like treaty. So that reciprocity and commitment is treaty that will share the land together 100%, live together, just like Peg was saying to Selkirk, we're still going to use the river. That's what the treaty process was supposed to look like from the Indigenous side of things. But for Canada, it's about taking the land. It's about using the Royal Proclamation, which set up the terms that the king would say, we'll set aside a reserved lands for you. That's where the term reserve comes from. And then you will be under the laws as my subject. Canada makes that law in 1867, Section 9124, which says that Indigenous peoples will become wards of the state, like children. And there's an actual legal term for this called the fiduciary relationship by the federal government in relation to Indigenous peoples, which is basically parent-child. So Indigenous peoples, for instance, don't own land. We don't have roles or responsibilities in the creation of laws in our communities. We can create band council resolutions via chief and council, but they really don't have any teeth and they don't have any roles in relation to provincial law or federal law. Band council resolutions are basically about as useful as a civic bylaw. Good enough to give you a parking ticket, but that's about it. Don't actually have any meaning or influence on your life. And so the numbered treaties are supposed to be about sharing, and Canada's vision of treaties, however, are about taking the land. And you can see that within the treaty medals as a good example. So on this side right here, you can see the sun rising, and is the sun rising? Is the sun setting? For Canada, it's seen as Indigenous peoples are setting. They're the end of times. They used examples like the end of communities or the starvation of communities in Ontario, the sickness involving the end of the bison, and that Indigenous peoples are seen as really setting on a horizon. And for Indigenous peoples, however, treaties was seen as a future, as a possibility into the future. And that, my friends, is where reconciliation comes in. Reconciliation comes from Indigenous peoples believing almost to a fault that relationships are possible in a state, in a government, in law that is designed from day one to take the lands, hammer people onto reserves, put them under draconian control under the Indian Act, forbid economic production, taxation, forbid the ability of Indigenous peoples to be able to express themselves fully or self-determine or self-govern. Indigenous peoples cannot self-govern. Indian acts and councils are opposed by the Indian Act. It's not that they don't do good things, it's that they are not voted in by the people. They're not chosen by the people. The people have a democracy, meaning that they have a one vote system, but that's not the way our traditional governments worked. The way our traditional governments worked is they were worked on relationship. They included things like clan members and grandmothers in decision-making abilities. That's what reconciliation is supposed to look like. Now, as I end off here, as I finish off my conversation, I want to show you why it is so important that you understand everything that I just said, which is that treaties are about sharing, treaties are about commitments to each other, treaties are not about deciding who gets what land where, and one side gets very rich, the other side gets very poor under laws that are meant to control. There's even a pass system in place for years where Indigenous peoples couldn't move. They couldn't not send their children to residential school. They'd be arrested. They couldn't write letters to the government. In fact, there was a law in the 1930s which said that Indians couldn't write letters to the government to complain about anything. They had to give them to the Indian agent. And so those letters magically disappeared. Well, the truth is that we can either face that reality or have the reality thrust upon us. And here's the reality. We're the fastest growing population in Manitoba. We're the fastest growing population in Canada as well, too. We grew 42.5% Indigenous young people across Canada in 10 years, from 2006 to 2016. Now, most of those people were Métis. They self-declare as Métis, half of them. That means that not that we suddenly had a bunch of Métis people show up, and 42.5% population growth is impossible. It means every second person had to have a baby, which is impossible because there's elders, children, people who are not childbearing like myself. It's impossible to have every second Indigenous person have a child. Are Indigenous families bigger? Yes, a little bit, 2.1 to 1.2 children, Indigenous to non-Indigenous families. But what it actually tells you, because of the growth of Métis communities, is that it's safe for the first time in history to call yourself Indigenous. So you get people like Brian Bowman, who's the mayor of Winnipeg, who calls himself Métis in the middle of an election campaign. I'm not questioning his claims on that. All I'm saying is that you can't just claim to be Indigenous on a Friday. Once you claim something, and you may have ancestry in which to do so, you must then build a relationship with that community. So it's not about who you claim, it's who claims you. So if, for example, if people on this call have ancestry, you have Métis relationships, or you have Anishinaabe or Cree ancestry in your background, or Dakota Lakota, or whatever that might be, that gives you an opportunity. You are not automatically a part of that community. Like all communities, there's an initiation process. There is a certification process or a recognition process. That means that you must go to that community, you must earn your ties and your relationships, and then eventually you will be called a member of that community if you're good enough, if you're ethical enough, if you contribute. Nobody likes adopting freeloaders. So you, if you want to claim being an Anishinaabe or Cree, you can do that, but then you must then build a relationship. And you really can only call yourself Anishinaabe or Cree when other Anishinaabe or Cree call you that name. Now, I tell you all that because we see this tremendous growth in Manitoba, but also Ontario, Saskatchewan. But you don't see a lot of representation of Indigenous peoples in Ontario, even though they have the largest population of Indigenous peoples. They have the largest amount of Indigenous peoples in the country, but yet you don't ever see it. You don't see any civic leaders that are Indigenous. You see no provincial leaders that are Indigenous. You see no major business leaders that are Indigenous, very few anyways. That's interesting because what it's going to tell you is that that is happening in Winnipeg. Indigenous peoples are heading up political parties. Indigenous peoples are heading up the Chamber of Commerce of downtown Winnipeg. Indigenous peoples are being hired, the highest amount of hires at both my two workplaces, Winnipeg Free Press, also University of Manitoba. Indigenous peoples are being hired more and more and more than anyone else. And that's interesting. It tells you that Canada's future population relates to Indigenous peoples in some way. So why is that? Between the ages of 5 and 19 is the average Indigenous population. Between 35 and 59 is the average non-Indigenous population. So that tells you that Indigenous peoples are incredibly young. We're also some of the largest segments of communities. We do live on reserves. Of course, 40% of Indigenous peoples live on reserve, but the average age of on reserve is 41 years old. The average age off reserve is 21 years old. So that tells you that proportion matters. Where is the largest proportion of Indigenous peoples? Well, Manitoba and Saskatchewan. The largest red dots on this map are Manitoba and Saskatchewan. If you cannot work with Indigenous peoples, you are unemployable. Because why? Because you're going to meet them. You're going to be sitting on the bus beside them. You might be married to an Indigenous person, whatever that might be. But far more importantly, we're all going to have to work together. We're all going to have to figure out a way to live together. And also in Manitoba, we may be seeing, remember that I talked about that professional class of Indigenous peoples? We may be seeing more of those in workplaces than almost anywhere else. We're producing 2,500 of them at the University of Manitoba. We only have 20,000 students. We have 2,400 of them at the University of Manitoba, self-declared Indigenous students. That means that every single person working with, living beside, being married to an Indigenous person will be a reality, is already a reality. Ontario's yet waking up to that reality. BC only yet waking up, even though they have huge populations, they still refuse to recognize that Indigenous peoples are contributing to the economy. In Manitoba, we do. We can't deny it. In fact, an Indigenous person employed, working at multiple jobs, paying, frankly, tens of thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars in taxes through my lifetime, speaking to you right now. Gives us possibility, gives us a reminder of the possibility. You know what the possibility is that Indigenous peoples are growing faster than anyone else. And who do you think is going to fill in the jobs? How are we going to return to the 19th century where Indigenous peoples took care of everybody, like Peguis with Selkirk, and Indigenous peoples will be paying taxes, working in the long-term care facilities, working in the front lines of cities? I'll give you a little stat here for an example. Indigenous peoples are not only the fastest growing population, but we're also the fastest growing labor economy. And so we contribute hundreds of millions of dollars to Manitoba's economy every year. And part of that is through urban reserves, which are land owed to First Nations as a result of not adequately fulfilling treaty obligations and commitments that were made way back in 1870. So Indigenous First Nations are owed territory. So we open up like Cap Young Barracks, for example, or 1075 Portage. We open up urban reserve space in the city. There's a gas station out near Polo Park. And we open up those reserves. And what we realize, those little urban reserve spaces, we realize that with a very small amount of funding, tens of thousands of dollars, which is pennies, not even pennies, fractions of pennies for a civic budget, for a provincial budget. And we say, okay, we're going to support this First Nation through a little bit of funding and infrastructure. We're also going to talk to the federal government, get it appointed as an urban reserve. Through that tiny little fractions of a penny, in the case of 1075 Portage, everyone's property value in the west end of Winnipeg, one of the most economically depressed areas of the city, where nobody wanted to move into that office building except for Peguis First Nation. Because Peguis First Nation moved in there, created commercial development, now there's a pharmacy there, now there's office spaces there. Everyone's home value from the guaranteed commercial investment went up 15%. That means that for fractions of pennies of a dollar from Manitoba's commitment, tens of thousands of Winnipeggers and their families benefited as a result. Through property value increases, through infusion and supports, less crime in those communities, tons of presence of diversity and supports for young people in those areas as well. It's really interesting. I'm going to tell you something very interesting about what's happening in Manitoba and Saskatchewan is different than everywhere else. You only see urban reserves in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, a few out in BC, a couple in Alberta, but Saskatchewan and Manitoba is where you see the most amount. You not only see Indigenous professionals in those places as well, but you also see innovative ideas and programming. Here's an innovative idea. Why don't we invest in every First Nation who's owned land to try to get land to operate in the city? Because they'll make commercial development like a water park or I don't know, a gas station. And here's what will happen is everyone's property value will increase. Everybody will benefit, more commercial development for that area. Maybe might even support businesses throughout the community as well. And you're saying to yourself, well, that seems like a no-brainer. Well, it is a no-brainer because people continue to imagine that Indigenous peoples are getting all these things for free when they get nothing for free because Canada's already taken and stolen 99% of the land. Now, for that tiny fractions of a dollar to invest in a First Nation, then how much money do we give in tax breaks to IKEA or Walmart or Hudson Bay Company? How many billions of dollars do we just give to them and get almost nothing back in return? A few low-wage jobs, a little bit of economy creation, but generally they take all the profit and take it elsewhere, usually to Toronto or New York or Chicago or whatever else. And then when they don't make money and profit, they just leave, like Hudson Bay here in downtown Winnipeg. They just left. First Nations don't leave. Like, we don't just leave our own territory. We're always going to be here. So for fractions of pennies on a dollar to support urban reserve development, we should take money that the billions that we just give away to corporations, we should be giving those to First Nations to develop areas of the city for urban reserves, because it'd be commercial development. There's no like, people are like, oh, well, what if they open up a poverty facility or a rehab facility in my neighborhood? That's not what First Nations are going to do when they get urban spaces. They're going to create commercial development, because it's the only place that we can make money to support our communities, because the Indian Act chokes the life out of us and refuses our ability to get credit. People can't get credit cards, can't get business loans on First Nations. The only money that can be anywhere is from Chief and Council, and that's for programming. So there's no money on a First Nation at all. Here's what we do at the University of Manitoba, and this is where I'll end off. At the University of Manitoba, we're trying to commit to Indigenous students. So we have 2,500 Indigenous students, nearly 11% of this total student population on campus. When you make space for Indigenous peoples, remarkable things happen. And so you at the Assiniboine Community College no doubt know this as a truth, that when you invest in Indigenous students, Indigenous peoples do amazing things that we maybe have never seen before. Like this guy right here, this is Nathan Legacy. He got involved with the Indigenous Student Council at the University of Manitoba, but at the same time, he wrote a master's degree on Indigenous video games. Do you know how many people have a master's degree on Indigenous video games? One, and you're looking at it. He's got jobs offers everywhere, including in Michigan. He works at the University of Winnipeg. He's a sessional instructor now. Here's Jonathan Coachman. He's writing a Cree opera. Here's Ashley Richard and Jeremy McKay up here. They're writing, they finished classes on Indigenous capitalism or Indigenous economic development. What does Indigenous businesses look like when they're not solely about profit and exploitation, individual benefit, but they're about community development. They're about communal development, sharing profits. What does that look like? Is that beneficial? Is that possible? And I could keep talking to you about every single student in these pictures. They're amazing. They do dynamic, interesting things. That's what happens when you invest in Indigenous peoples. And here's what happened when you invested in Braden Harper. Braden Harper is a 20-year-old. He came from, he's an urban reserve guy, urban Indigenous guy. But he started working for the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, and he studied everything that this presentation is about. He studied that treaty is about sharing land 100%, sharing everything, sharing relationships. It's about peace. It's about harmony. It's about our children living together. And he got a job for the Bombers. And what he noticed was this, that football is about land theft. The goal of football is steal as much land as possible, and then you get rewarded for it. Just watch any quarterback sack or touchdown run or a field goal. Everybody goes berserk when you steal the land. Everyone loves it. Now, Indigenous peoples, maybe not so much. So it's not that I don't like the Bombers. I have season tickets. I'm a big fan. But that when we celebrate land theft as a story of our community, maybe we should also tell stories about how we're treaty people, that we're together. And this is what he did. He got the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to recognize treaty relationships in the games themselves with the national anthem. So alongside O Canada, Indigenous peoples, or the territorial acknowledgement takes place. We recognize people, we see people, and we commit to them. Remember, that's what the territorial acknowledgement is all about. Well, it turns out that there's sports franchises in the city, and the Jets and the Edmonton Oilers saw what the Bombers did, the first professional sports franchise in North America to make a territorial acknowledgement, and then they did one as well. The Jets did this commitment. I wrote it for them. It's a really remarkable, beautiful commitment. And the NHL, let me tell you, wasn't happy about it. They didn't like that they were going to be impeding on some of the protocols involving NHL games. However, the Winnipeg Jets stood up for the Indigenous community and said, no, this is what we do to be a member of this community, and made sure that they understood that. And then 2 weeks before the pandemic, the Jets also did this.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm Bell MTS Place welcome to the Strong Warrior Girls Anishinaabe singers, who will perform our national anthem in Ojibwe.
Okay. Now, the Jets didn't just do that. They indigenized the logo. They had a big drum open up the night. They had Métis throat sing, Métis jiggers sing. They had Inuit throat singers. They also, by the way, the Jets, I wrote about this in some columns of the Winnipeg Free Press, they fund Indigenous hockey teams. They try to hire Indigenous peoples to the tune of the same percentage as in the downtown area of Winnipeg. They also support Indigenous health programming, mental health particularly, programming for kids that are in the child welfare system. So Jets do some important things. And let me tell you that a bunch of kids singing "O Canada" in Ojibwe doesn't change anything. It doesn't change land theft. It doesn't get rid of the Indian Act. It doesn't change the Canada's ongoing genocidal treatment of Indigenous peoples. It doesn't change much at all. But here's what it does do: show you Kanata. It shows you the possibilities of Kanata. It shows you what a village looks like. It shows you what we were supposed to be in the first place. It shows you what it means when we share territory together. It shows you the best of what treaty has to offer. And like a story, it lasts for 15 minutes, 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and then it fades away. And then we go back to Canada, the place of spices and gold that don't give anybody riches, but divide people and commit us to a path of violence and genocide. And I'm not saying that I don't like electricity. I'm not saying I don't like oil. I'm not saying I don't like, driving a car. All I'm saying is that that's the path that destroys everyone. The path that builds everyone is the path where we commit to one another. The path of the village, the path of seeing everyone as valuable, as all of us working together, good, bad, great, ugly. And for even a Jets game, 15,000 people who are not known as being, we're not talking about treaty when it comes to the Jets, but they are making that territorial acknowledgement, committing to relationships with Indigenous peoples, and then demonstrating it. That's what the territorial acknowledgement is. We see the people, we show the people, we commit to the people. That's what treaty looks like. Treaty looks like we are all in this together. What the treaty says is this is how we live together. How we live together is more reciprocal and committed at spaces in those little 15 minutes at the Jets game, in the territorial acknowledgement that you made at the beginning, or perhaps I would go so far to say that during this week that you're holding with Indigenous stories as being a segment and a part of your institution, this is how we live together. We learn from one another, we recognize one another, we commit to one another. And that's what you've been doing all week. and as a part of this Indigenous Storytelling Week. And therefore, you are living treaty, you are living kanata. And maybe if we stretch it beyond a week, maybe into a year, maybe for the rest of our lives, we could fulfill the original vision of what we were to do, which was to give tobacco to one another, to commit that 100 hours to one another, that gift, and to expect those who commit to us to also give those gifts of 100 hours to one another. And imagine how much we would get along. Imagine how much we would care for one another. Imagine how our children would marry and care for one another as well. Imagine what the future would look like if we saw each other as family. Family we could depend on, family we could believe in, family that would never give up on us. So with that, I say huge miigwech, and thank you for inviting me to Storytelling Week at Assiniboine Community College. I really appreciate it. I really appreciate your time and your effort, and I really appreciate being included. So of course, this session was brought to you by the Treaty Relations Commission of Manitoba, who are those who are supporting and bringing speakers like myself to audiences like you. And so you can book speakers through the Treaty Relations Commission for free. All you have to do is contact them. And what they do is they set us up and they provide us with support, and they book us to be able to come to your organization or your church group or your classroom or whatever that looks like. Our Treaty Relations Commission is really great. And I'm not sure if Jeremy, who's sometimes on the calls to hear my presentations, I'm not sure if he's here, but if he's here, then Jeremy from the Treaty Relations Commission, big shout out to you. And also our Treaty Relations Commission, which is Loretta Ross. And so I have a few moments for comments or questions. If you want to ask something or just want to talk or you just want to say something, that's fine too. I do have to go though in about 8 minutes because I have the State of the Inner City report, which I'm one of the writers of, which is being released in 18 minutes here in Winnipeg from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. It's a really big deal online. Check it out if you have a chance. It's going to be live on Facebook. What we did is we studied inner city communities during the COVID-19 pandemic, and we uncovered some of the really great, incredible work that's taking place, even though the Premier, the government, even the federal government have been rapidly decreasing and debilitating spaces in the inner city. Organizations, most of them volunteer, are building the inner city and saving lives, particularly Indigenous lives. So with that, I got to leave in a few minutes. But miigwech, everybody. Thank you very much.
Oh, Niigaan, thank you so much. I too am I finished wiping the tears away. That was a powerful way to end this. I wanted to share a couple of things. We might have time for a couple of questions just around, you talked about the economic impact, and the Rural Development Institute of Brandon University did a study in 2016. And some of the results from that were that they noticed creation of over 35,000 jobs and maintained over 35,000 jobs, contributed 2.3 billion to Manitoba's GDP, provided 1.3 billion in wages and salaries to workers, and contributed 231 million in taxes to federal and provincial governments. And when you talk about place and space and giving Indigenous students an opportunity to grow and thrive, we started our peer mentorship program last year. And 2 of those peer mentors ended up being chosen as the valedictorians for the college, 2 amazing young individuals. And the last picture you showed was the drum circle at the Jets game, and that group actually participated in a musical experience here in Brandon a couple of years ago with Dr. Carabray, who was doing was introducing his composition on creation and had different music from all over the world. But it was one of my daughter's most memorable singing experiences because she was in the Niigaan choir, and the choirs were invited to participate and to sing the drum song with them. And I still remember the looks on their face. It was extremely powerful experience. So I want to thank you so much for joining us. We might have time for one question if anybody has any. I will read a couple of the quotes. Best teaching of the path of the Indigenous people that I've ever heard. So pleased to have been given the opportunity to learn Niigaan's perspective on We're in this together. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Yeah.
And Yes, and Deb Bertachin, who was one of our guest storytellers this week. I loved this. Thank you so much. I cried again watching these young girls. Tears of overwhelming pride and a bursting of my heart.
Yeah, we have to remember that, only 5 decades ago, people were banned from speaking languages in schools, traditional languages, Indigenous languages. And here we are, girls, most of them in the child welfare system, by the way, who are in that class. That's why they set up the immersion program at Riverbend School here in Winnipeg. Because they weren't getting the culture at home in their foster homes, so they set up the program involving the language at that school. Here we have them singing in front of 15,000 students, 15,000 people. And let me tell you, there's nothing wrong with Jets fans. I'm a Jets fan. I have a set of season tickets with my friends, but Jets fans are not known as, being big advocates for treaty rights. But then there they are cheering the territorial acknowledgement. Like when the territorial acknowledgement was made, everybody cheered. 15,000 people stood up and applauded. And then the second thing that happened is they cheered when these girls sang in Ojibwe, and they spoke with them when in the Winnipeg Jets game. There's this little tradition we have here in Winnipeg where we say "True North" as a part of the song, as a part of "O Canada." Well, Ace Burpee on 103 FM taught everybody to say "Giwaitin," which is where we say "Northern Wind," and that's what we heard everybody in our section say "Giwaitin" when True North took place. Pretty cool.
Absolutely brilliant. One quick question: is the word assimilation a historical concept, or does it still hurt and scare people?
No, assimilation's real. Assimilation looks like erasure and happens every single day. We have to work very hard to remind the forces in this country that we still exist. Assimilation is in every practice, in every place. We just had and I know that I'm going to try not to be too political here, but we just have a premier of our province just say that giving vaccinations to the hardest hit communities, I don't care who it is, it could be Steinbach for all it was, but it's because it's First Nations. He said, well, that's unfair to other Manitobans. That's assimilation. That's what that is. That's assimilation, is the idea that a people don't matter, that their cultural constituency, their difference, their independence is somehow a problem for everybody else. And that is just baffling. And so assimilation's real.
Okay, Dr. Sinclair, Niigaan, thank you so much. I wish you all the best. I would love to have you back again. This was fantastic. Good luck this afternoon. And if you want to leave us with any parting words, please. Okay.
In 12 minutes, yes. So.
Good luck in 12 minutes. And thank you so much for sharing. Thank you so much.
Question, is this going online? Is my question. Is this going somewhere, or are you?
It's recorded, and yeah, we post it to our page. And so if that's okay, everybody, we would like to share it with anybody who was unable to. I
just wasn't sure if it's is it going with all the other speakers as well?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay, great. Okay, well, miigwech, and good luck to everybody. Like I said, I am a Brandon. I am a Brandon alum. I consider my most formative years working at the Sportsplex with all the kids there. I also was the grade 9 third place spelling champion of the city. So literally my career peaked when I got third place in the city spelling bee championships, and then it's just plummeted since then.
I beg to differ, but I'll take your word for it.
No, I'm serious. Right. I still have the medal from the third place in Brandon, so I'm pretty proud of it. So there you go. Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for joining us. There is storytelling this evening at 5 o'clock with Elder Verna DeMontney, who is Métis and one of the last Michif fluent speakers in the province. And tomorrow we wrap things up with Eugene Ross, who's Dakota Elder from Sioux Valley. Miigwech, everyone. Take care.
Miigwech, you got 1 minute. Take care. Bye.